Hey everyone, and welcome to today's Lightroom tutorial. In today's video, we're going to be looking at how you can create a clean looking color grade across your beauty portraits, fashion portraits, and portraiture in general. So it's definitely been a while since I did a tutorial like this one. I think I did a similar one back in maybe 2016, maybe 2015. It's been a long time. So I thought it was time for an upgrade of this tutorial and how I would generally create a clean kind of effect in Lightroom. Now by clean, I'm basically talking about some nice, really simple adjustments that gives a good color grade, but without affecting the skin tones too much and the integrity of the skin tones, and also the integrity of the clothing that may be in the shot and other elements. So it's really just keeping those kind of tones fairly intact, but still color grading the image in a way that you can actually see it's been graded and it looks nice and natural. So this tutorial is going to be just basically all about that. Now, for those of you who don't know, I tend to use Lightroom and Capture One for my color grading these days for the bulk of the color grading that I would use. Now, it's just easier usually to batch edit images with color grades like this. Of course, you can do it in Photoshop as well, and I do still use Photoshop for some of my color grading. However, I like to use Capture One and Lightroom, especially if I'm doing editorials or if I'm doing something for a client. I feel like it's a really easy way to see everything in a batch kind of environment and see how everything looks next to each other, especially for magazine editorials and things like that, because you'll be able to see how everything looks tone-wise together really, really easily rather than importing everything into Photoshop. So we're gonna get straight into the tutorial today. Let's get into Lightroom. So now we're about to dive into Lightroom, and for today's tutorial, I'm basically just going to be doing a walkthrough of what I would usually do when I'm editing my images, and if I really want to get that kind of softer, cleaner effect. I'll show you some of the adjustments that I usually tend to make and how I would generally approach and apply them to my images. I think it's always difficult doing tutorials like this because doing exact numbers like I used to do in terms of like color grading and things like that was always a little bit difficult because it's always going to look different on your image. So I sometimes think that it's better to do more of a walkthrough process, talk about how I would approach different sliders or different effects, and kind of show you how you can apply this to your own images. So now that we're in Lightroom, I'm just going to go through a couple of the sliders that I would use in this situation, especially with this photo where there's a little bit more contrast. Now, sometimes I really like to get that kind of clean, muted effect with my images, but obviously for an image like this, there is a little bit of contrast. Like I just said, the highlights are quite bright and then the shadows are quite dark. So I think it's all about kind of evening out images like this a little bit first, so we have a little bit more to work with when it comes to our range of sliders. So let's kind of just mute this image a little bit more and remove some of that contrast, just kind of make it look, I guess, a little bit flatter initially. So to do this, we're just going to bring down the contrast. That can be the first thing that you can use. And then I would usually move the shadows up a little bit as well. So I'm just holding down to show you the before and after at the moment. So this is the before and then that's the after. So you can see it's just sort of muted the image from before. We're sort of just kind of making it appear a little bit more flat. So I'm just going to continue with those sliders, just kind of evening it out a little bit more. So we just have that little bit more to work with. The next slider I'm actually going to bring down is the highlights because it's quite bright just over the clothing here. So we want to make sure that that is kind of being evened out a little bit too. Maybe bring down the whites a bit. And you can also bring the blacks up if you're finding that that is still a little bit too contrasted. So we'll just bring that up a little bit as well. So again, before, after, we're really just kind of evening out the image so we have a little bit more of a clean slate to work with. So I am going to move the clarity up though just a little bit because I always like to increase the clarity in my images and sometimes even the texture just to give it that little bit more of a sharper, enhanced effect. And I might just move up the texture a little bit as well just to make sure we've got a fairly sharp looking image. Now I'm going to actually go down to the tone curve, and this is why I wanted to kind of flatten out the image initially. So we've got a little bit more to work with in the tone curve. Now we can kind of go a little bit more wild than what we would have been able to if the image was still quite heavily contrasted. So I'm actually going to bring up the curve here, and we're just going to kind of give the image a little bit more brightness overall. And you can kind of move this curve to however you like. Where I'm going to add a little bit of the contrast back is just going to be kind of at this point on the line. I mean, obviously you can really experiment with this. There's so many endless ways you can use curves in Lightroom to create different effects. You do kind of have to be careful with not going too overboard, especially if you are looking for that cleaner effect though. So let's just do another before and then after. So you can see it's really taking on a completely different look overall in the image. Now, what I'm also going to do is I'm going to bring down the highlights a little bit, and we're just going to make this a little bit more muted. So the more I bring this down, the more the highlights are going to look flatter and more muted overall. So I'm just going to bring that down a little bit, and I'm actually going to leave the shadows where they are. I'm not going to adjust that. I'm not going to bring them down or up. I'm just going to leave them as is. So again, before and after, we've definitely got a more flatter style image here. We've got a little bit more to work with rather than sticking with the original contrasted image where the lighting was a little bit more contrasted. We're just kind of giving it a bit of a different effect now. Now, usually if I want to kind of reach a very clean effect with my images, I will desaturate skin tones a little bit, because quite often on camera they do get captured a little bit more saturated than what I would usually like, and it can kind of throw the image off depending on what you're aiming for. So usually to do this in Lightroom, it's a really easy way to do this, and it's just by going into the color mixer, then going into the oranges. Usually oranges, reds, yellows are where you're going to find a lot of the skin tone colors, and usually orange, you can just kind of move down the saturation. Now, you don't want to move it down too far because they will start to look a little bit sickly, the skin tones. So we're going to move it down, but not too far. So around about there is looking quite good. So again, before, after, you can see how that skin tone just being pulled down a little bit is just helping to even out the image even more and really give it that muted effect. Now, for the actual color grading segment of this, you can either go to your tone curve, which is where I was before, and you can go into the reds, greens, and blues to kind of alter colors. It's not my favorite way to adjust colors. I think that sometimes using curves to adjust colors can be great, but usually for my more editorial images, sometimes I find you have to be really particular with how you adjust the colors in tone curve, because sometimes they can just look too out there or, you know, really affect the quality of the image too. So usually I do prefer to actually go down to the color grading section and start moving the colors based around the shadows, highlights, and midtones. Now, if you really wanted to, you could just stick with this kind of toning of the image if you like that little bit more of a muted, desaturated look. But for the purpose of this tutorial, I am going to start adjusting the midtones, and we'll just kind of see what is going to work best. Personally, I find that like a little bit more of a golden element in this image is quite nice. So I'm gonna actually just do that. And you can actually move this slider here that will adjust how it's applied. So I kind of like applying it with a little bit more brightness. So just moving that up a little bit. And you can also change the blending and balance down the bottom here, depending on how you like this. So I feel like just moving the balance a little bit over that side. And then you can also change the shadows, which is sometimes something that I will leave out of my color grading. It really depends on the effect that I'm going for, because the shadows can be really standout. And if I'm looking for a clean kind of effect with my images, sometimes I don't want that. But let's just kind of move the slider around and we'll see what kind of effect we can go for. Actually don't mind a cooler kind of shadow in this. I think that that actually works pretty well. So kind of having that contrast between the midtones and the shadows. The midtones a little bit more, slightly more golden toned. The shadows are a little bit more blue toned. It's kind of a good contrast there. And then also for highlights, this is also something you can leave out if you're looking for a very clean effect, because again, the more you move this around, it's really going to adjust the skin tone in particular, especially in this image where it's looking a little bit brighter. But I think for now, I'm going to move this again over, just over a little bit to the cool side, just for a slight kind of cool effect. Now, let's do a quick before, so you can see how different this image is starting to look now. This is the before, this is the after. Before, after. What I am going to do before we move on is actually go back up to the curves, and we're just going to bring down just the brightness a little bit. We don't want it to be affecting the quality of the image too much, because as I said before, sometimes curves can kind of do that to your images. It can kind of push things too far in a direction that you don't want it to go. And then just to bring maybe a little bit of the highlights back, just to kind of give it a little bit more of a punch. And you can also up the saturation of the image a little bit if you're finding that it's just looking a little bit too flat still. So again, before, after, before, after. And let's quickly look at these side by side so you can see the different effect that this image now has. It definitely has a little bit more of an evened out, cleaner feel to it and a little bit more of a muted tone. Now, if you've watched my channel before, you'll know that I absolutely love doing film color grades and things like that. I've always been very inspired by that in my work. Now, as I mentioned, one of the most important things I think with creating a real kind of clean color grade and something that's a little bit more muted like this, evened out, is to really, in the first place, when you're editing your raw images, it's good to kind of take that contrast out of the image if it does look quite contrasted, just to really give it that little bit more of a flatter effect initially, so then you've got a little bit more to work with when it comes to toning your image, when it comes to even adjusting the curves of the image. I do think that it helps with the quality and retaining that quality when you do that first, because if you don't, then you're going to end up trying to color grade an image like this one here while it's still quite contrasted, and things can be quite hard to bring back as well once you've already started working on the colors and kind of overlaying that onto a very contrasted image. So that's why I personally love doing it this way, and like I said, you can go back in the end and really bring back any highlights that you feel should kind of pop a little bit more and add a little bit more contrast into it. But let's do a quick before and after again. So this is the before and then this is the after. So hopefully you've enjoyed this tutorial and hopefully you've learned something new from it. Let me know down in the comment section how you like to approach cleaner color grades on your images, and if you like to do things in a similar way or if you do things in a totally different way, because there's no wrong answers with this kind of stuff, and there's so many different ways that you can do color grades in both Lightroom and Photoshop and Capture One and all the other editing programs out there. So I'd love to hear from you guys how you like to approach your images with this kind of technique. And also let me know down in the comment section if you'd like to see more color grading tutorials. Thank you so much for watching this video today, and if you liked it, please give it a thumbs up, and if you haven't subscribed to my channel already, make sure you do, because I'll be posting a lot more tutorials like this one in future. Let me know down in the comment section how you like to color grade your images these days, and let me know if there's any specific tutorials that you'd like to see on my channel in future, because I would love to hear your thoughts. But thank you so much for watching today's video, and I'll see you in the next one.